Picture a dim corridor in a sprawling old house in Allahabad. A thin, sickly girl of 10 stands alone, clutching a crumpled tricolor flag in her fist. On the other side of the door, British policemen in heavy boots are tearing her home apart. Her father is in prison. Her mother is fighting tuberculosis. She has no siblings, no real friends, and no one to tell her how this story ends. Now jump forward. In less than 3 decades, that same lonely girl will command the world's largest democracy, stare down generals and presidents, split her own party in half, and send tanks into the streets of her own capital. She will be called Ma Durga and the only man in her cabinet, and she will die in a pool of blood on the path between her home and office, shot by the very guards paid to protect her. Between those two images, the frightened child and the iron-willed leader, lies a race against time, time before her enemies inside. The Congress Party outmaneuver her, time before her father's generation disappears, time before the fragile country she inherits tears itself apart. And from the very beginning, somewhere out there in that same party, a future rival is already sharpening his knives, convinced that this shy girl will never be more than Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter. But he is wrong. She is Indira Gandhi. And her story does not begin in power. It begins in loneliness. Indira Priyadarshini Nehru was born on 19th of November 1917 into privilege and captivity all at once. Privilege because the Nehrus were one of the most prominent families in northern India. Lawyers, landowners, educated in English. Schools, comfortable in big houses with servants and gardens. Captivity because every wall of her childhood home, Anand Bhavan, seemed to echo with the clang of prison doors. Her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, was not around to read bedtime stories. He was in British jails writing political essays on scraps of paper. The house itself was a paradox. From the outside, it looked like a palace. Wide verandas, columns, polished floors, portraits on the walls. Inside, it was often almost empty. Kamala Nehru, Indira's mother, coughed herself weak under white hospital sheets, shuttled between Allahabad and sanatoriums for tuberculosis. Visiting politicians came and went, voices rising in urgent argument over the future of India. But when the doors closed and the cars drove away, when the echo of male voices faded, Indira was left in a silence that felt too big for one child. She wandered those corridors like a ghost in her own home. There were books, of course, shelves and shelves of them, but few toys, few playmates. Instead of fairy tales, she got thick letters from prison. Jawaharlal, behind bars in Naini jail or Almora, wrote to his only daughter about the French Revolution, about science, about world history. He explained nationalism and imperialism to a girl who still kept her hair in plaits. He did not write, "Once upon a time." He wrote, "My dear Indu, life is not easy. You must be strong." Outside, the British Raj made sure of that. Indira's first clear memory of power was not her father giving a speech, but policemen tearing through her safe spaces. Search warrants slapped onto polished tables, boots on marble, strange men riffling through cupboards, leafing through private letters as if they were garbage. She watched an officer kick open a trunk where she had hidden forbidden Congress literature, her heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. The Raj did not care that she was a child. The Raj saw only that she was a Nehru. Sometimes for a few months Jawaharlal would be home. Those were the bright, feverish days. The house would fill with people. Mahatma Gandhi, tall and frail in his dhoti, Motilal Nehru, the imposing grandfather, Sarojini Naidu, with her laughter, serious men like Vallabhbhai Patel, and young, intense Congress workers from all over India, including a stern-faced man from Bombay, Morarji Desai, who watched everything with the measuring eyes of a future accountant of power. Morarji barely noticed the little girl in the background carrying tea trays, struggling to look invisible. Why would he? The Congress was a man's world, a world of prison, sacrifice, speeches, a world of hard discipline, not of shy children. But Indira was watching, always watching. When she was 11, the movement came right to her doorstep. In 1928 to 29, the campaign for complete independence was gathering force. Demonstrations filled Allahabad streets. One day she watched her mother Kamala struggling in a crowd, wrapped in a plain sari, joining other women in a picket line outside a government building. There was shouting. A line of policemen advanced with batons. What could a sick, soft-spoken woman do against a trained colonial police force? Very little. but she stood her ground. Indira saw her mother pushed, jostled, nearly knocked to the dirt, and something hot and sharp crystallized in the child's chest. Rage, helplessness, shame that she was too small, too frail to do anything but watch. That night she lay awake, telling herself one simple truth: I will never be that helpless again. By the time she was 12, she had found a way, small, childish, but real, to fight. While the grown men were being arrested in droves, she gathered the ones no one noticed, the children. She created the Vanar Sena, the Monkey Brigade, inspired by the mythic army of Hanuman. Little boys and girls on rattling bicycles, slipping messages under doors, distributing banned pamphlets, hiding Congress flags in their school bags. Picture it: a skinny girl in a simple frock standing in a dusty lane, whispering instructions to a cluster of kids with huge eyes. Each paper they carried, each scrap of cloth with the forbidden tricolor, could mean a beating or a jail term if the police caught them. For the Raj, they were just naughty children. For Indira, they were soldiers. One afternoon, a policeman did stop her. "What's in your bag?" "Books," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Her fingers clutched the strap so tightly they hurt. Inside were forbidden leaflets for a Congress meeting. He looked at her too large eyes and bony wrists, and laughed. "Run along, little Mem Sahib." She walked away, heart pounding with the first intoxicating taste of outwitting power. Yet, even as she played this dangerous game, another enemy was eating away at her life far more cruelly than any British officer: time. Time was killing her mother. Kamala's tuberculosis worsened. Doctors in India were blunt. If she wanted to live, she needed cleaner air, better treatment. Europe. The Nehrus sent her to Switzerland, and Indira followed for stretches. There, high in the crisp mountain air, the fight for India's freedom seemed strangely distant. Nurses, not policemen, moved quietly through the corridors. The smell was not of dust and sweat, but of antiseptic and boiled potatoes. Indira, still a teenager, was shuttled between worlds: the drama of revolution in India, the sterile quiet of sanatoriums in Europe, and then the poetic refuge of Santiniketan, where Rabindranath Tagore gave her a different kind of education. At Visva Bharati, he renamed her Priyadarshini, the one who is pleasant to look at, as if trying to see past the worry etched into her young face. But she never fully belonged anywhere. In Europe, she was the colonial girl with an impossible country. At Santiniketan, she was the restless child of politics. At school in England, at badminton in Bristol, then at Somerville College, Oxford, she was the Indian who was always ill, always exhausted, never quite finishing her exams. The future Prime Minister of India never earned a university degree. Years later, rivals would use that as a weapon. She's not even properly educated. Still, the world she saw in those European years burned itself into her memory. Fascism on the rise in Germany and Italy, refugees on train platforms, newspaper headlines about civil war in Spain, Hitler's speeches on the radio. She listened, watched, and learned a harsh lesson. When a state is weak, when leaders are indecisive, the world can descend into chaos overnight. Back home, Indian leaders debated tactics. In Europe, dictators simply acted. That contrast struck her like a slap. In the midst of this swirling, dangerous world, another presence moved steadily closer. Feroz Gandhi. He was not a relative of Mahatma Gandhi. He was a Parsi youth from Allahabad, sharp-eyed and stubborn, who had thrown himself into the Congress movement early on. He first came into the Nehru orbit as a volunteer, one of many young men willing to be beaten and jailed. He admired Kamala's quiet courage and helped her during protests. Indira watched him. The way he argued, the way he refused to be intimidated by officials, the way he cared about her ailing mother, and a bond formed almost without her noticing. He was not what the elite Nehru family had in mind for their only daughter. He was not a zamindar's son or a polished barrister from London. He was intense, restless, a political animal. Jawaharlal worried. Gandhi himself hesitated. There were long, painful conversations, letters, ultimatums. Indira was pulled between the expectations of her father, the towering figure of Indian nationalism, and the stubborn loyalty she felt for the man who had stood by her and by her mother when others merely offered sympathy. The deadline that really decided it was not political at all. It was mortality. Kamala's condition worsened in Switzerland in the mid-1930s. Indira watched helplessly as her mother, still barely in her 30s, faded. On 28 February 1936, Kamala Nehru died. No more time, no more second chances. That loss tore a hole in Indira's world, and into it rushed a fierce determination. She would not let other people arrange her life as they had arranged her mother's doomed exile. If she had to choose, she would choose boldly, even recklessly. In March 1942, with the world at war and the British Empire fighting for survival, Indira married Feroz Gandhi in Allahabad. It was a simple ceremony conducted under the gaze of a skeptical political family. Outside, the empire that had ruled India for almost 2 centuries was under immense pressure. Inside, a different battle was beginning. The battle over Indira's identity. Was she Jawaharlal's daughter or Feroz's wife? A Nehru or a Gandhi? The marriage was barely a few months old when the Quit India movement erupted. In August 1942, the Congress, pushed beyond patience by arrests and broken promises, called for the British to leave India immediately. The Raj answered not with negotiation but with handcuffs. Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, almost the entire Congress leadership, were arrested overnight. India was suddenly a leaderless cauldron. Feroz was thrown in jail. Indira herself was arrested briefly, then released, then harassed, her every move watched. She was barely 25, newly married, pregnant, and living under a regime that treated her not as a bride but as a potential insurgent. Her first son, Rajiv, was born in 1944 into a country that was still a British possession, still racked by famine and war, yet seething with the promise of something new. Her second son, Sanjay, followed in 1946 as negotiations over independence grew more urgent and more poisonous, because the clock was ticking for the empire too. In 1947, the British announced they would leave, not someday, but by a specific date. Originally, it was to be June 1948. Then, pressed by impatient politicians and their own exhaustion, they moved it up. Suddenly, a hard deadline loomed. 15th of August 1947. At the stroke of midnight, power would be transferred. But transferred to what? A united India? A divided land? A dream or a nightmare? As politicians carved lines on maps talking of Pakistan and Hindustan, chaos exploded outside the conference rooms. In Delhi, where Indira now lived with her father at 17 York Road, the air itself felt charged with fear. Columns of refugees choked the roads, camps sprang up overnight, and the railway stations turned into scenes from hell. Trains arrived in the capital not full of people but of bodies, hacked, burned, swollen in the heat. Indira drove through that new capital in a battered car, often late at night, carrying blankets, food, medicines to refugee camps. Fires burned on the horizon as Hindu and Muslim mobs attacked each other. Families who had lost everything clutched at her sorry. "You are Nehru's daughter. Why can't you stop this?" What could she say? She'd grown up believing that when her father spoke, history shifted. But here was history, wild and bloody and indifferent to speeches. The gap between power and control carved itself into her heart. On the night of 14th or 15th August 1947, while Jawaharlal Nehru stood in Parliament and declared India's tryst with destiny, while celebrations erupted across the new nation, Indira felt both the ecstasy of victory and the weight of what it cost. It wasn't a neat ending. It was a terrifying beginning. The British had gone, but the deadlines hadn't. Now the countdown was different. Now it was about how long this experiment, a poor, divided, wounded country trying to be a democracy, could survive. And for Indira personally, another clock had started to tick. Her father's health. Power-aged Jawaharlal. The years after independence were relentless, a blur of crises, Kashmir, Hyderabad, linguistic riots, food shortages, foreign policy battles. Indira watched him grow thinner, more lined, his hair whiter. He was still the towering figure of Indian politics, but at home in the quiet of the evening he was sometimes just an old man rubbing, his temples too tired to speak. She moved closer to him, literally and metaphorically. She managed his household, his schedule, the stream of visitors who came begging for favors or appointments or decisions. She turned the Prime Minister's residence into a fortress of routine. Who could see him, when he would rest, how long a meeting would last. She carried a notebook, observed every face that came through the door, learned who was loyal, who was ambitious, who was quietly building an independent power base. Men like Morarji Desai, Desai, rigid, austere, famously self-disciplined, was climbing the ladder in Bombay and then on the national stage. Efficient, incorruptible, proud of his frugality, he represented a different vision of Congress, less romantic than Nehru's, more managerial, more conservative. To people like him, Indira looked like part of the problem, a symbol of the emerging court around the prime minister, family influence, creeping into party affairs. In public, she was just the dutiful daughter. In private, she was becoming something else, a gatekeeper. And gatekeepers make enemies. Her marriage, too, was strained by that gate. After independence, Feroz had his own trajectory, a fiery parliamentarian, a fearless critic of corruption, writing for and then editing newspapers, exposing scandals, including some uncomfortably close to people in his father-in-law's circle. The Gandhi household was no serene family nest. It was a pressure cooker. They lived apart for stretches, he in Allahabad, she in Delhi. Whispers spread in drawing rooms and newspapers. Were they separated? Was the marriage over? The twist, rarely acknowledged at the time, was that Feroz Gandhi, the man whose surname she kept and who would inadvertently help shape her political brand, was in some ways more of a rebel than anyone allowed her to be. She, for now, was still the shadow, until gradually the shadow stepped into the light. In the 1950s, Indira's role inside the Congress Party grew quietly but steadily. She joined the Congress Working Committee. She traveled across the country, not as a headline speaker, but as an organizer, listening to local leaders, memorizing names, faces, grudges. In village after village, in dusty district headquarters, ordinary workers looked at her and felt something they did not always feel. For the older leaders, a personal connection. She was Nehru's daughter, yes, but she was also a woman who would sit on the floor of a hut, drink a glass of water from a chipped metal cup, and listen. Some of the veterans didn't like it. They muttered about dynasty. They told themselves, and each other, that once Nehru was gone, they would reassert real party discipline, that they would never allow a family line to take over the Congress. Among those veterans were men like Morarji Desai, keeping score, counting allies, building networks. He wore white khadi and a stern expression like armor, and looked at Indira as if she were an anomaly, a temporary sentimental fixture. But time was not on their side. In 1958 to 59, Nehru's health took a worrying turn. Foreign trips left him exhausted. He began to forget words and speeches. The Congress needed to think about succession, about the next generation. And suddenly the shy, sickly girl of Anand Bhavan was not just a hostess or a gatekeeper. She was an obvious name, too obvious, some thought. In 1959, in a move that shocked many within the party, Indira Gandhi was elected president of the Indian National Congress. For her supporters, it was the natural elevation of a woman who had spent her whole life in the furnace of the freedom struggle, who knew the party from the inside. For her critics, it was the confirmation of their darkest fears. The Nehru family was turning the Congress into its private estate. Somewhere in Bombay, Morarji Desai noted the news with tight lips. A daughter had just stepped onto the battlefield he had spent his whole life preparing for, and the clock for both of them had just started ticking louder. In a smoky room in New Delhi, a circle of men in spotless white khadis sat around a long table and made what they thought was a clever, harmless decision. "Let her have it," one of them said. "She's Nehru's daughter. It will look good." They weren't giving away the Prime Minister's chair yet, only the presidency of the Indian National Congress in 1959, an internal party post, a decoration. They imagined a shy woman placing garlands, reading out carefully written speeches, smiling for photographers. A sentimental bridge between the heroic past of the freedom struggle and the hard pragmatism of the new republic. What none of them realized was that in that moment they had just opened the door for their own executioner, because Indira Gandhi did not treat the Congress presidency like a flower garland. She treated it like a weapon. As party president, she set out across India with a ferocity that surprised even those who thought they knew her. She didn't glide from one comfortable drawing room to another. She rode in rattling jeeps down muddy roads, sat cross-legged on village floors, listened to farmers talk about failed monsoons and empty granaries. She saw the gap between the triumphant speeches in Delhi and the hollow bellies in the countryside, and it shook her. In Kerala, that gap exploded into crisis. The state had elected the world's first democratically chosen communist government in 1957, and conservatives inside the Congress were furious. They wanted it dismissed. Indira, newly installed as party president, was drawn into a brutal behind-the-scenes tug-of-war. On one side, the syndicate, the powerful regional bosses around K, Kamaraj, and hardliners like Morarji Desai, who saw communism as a disease that had to be cut out. On the other, the ideal of democracy her father had preached all his life. If a government had been elected fairly, could you simply throw it out? In 1959, the central government did exactly that. The communist ministry in Kerala was dismissed, president's rule imposed. Legally possible, morally murkier. Publicly, Indira defended the decision. Privately, it disturbed her. She was tasting what power really felt like. Not noble slogans, but messy compromises and accusations. Critics called the move authoritarian, a warning of what might come if Delhi decided elections were mere formalities. The charge would haunt her later in far darker times. Meanwhile, the storm clouds over Indira's personal life were thickening. Her marriage to Feroz Gandhi had been rocky for years. Distance, quarrels, politics pulling them in different directions. In 1960, Feroz suffered a massive heart attack and died suddenly in New Delhi. The man who had walked with her through the terror of colonial prisons and the chaos of partition was gone at 47. She stood by his body in the hospital, watching the staff cover his face, and felt a familiar, icy emptiness. The same void that had opened when her mother died, when her father was taken to jail, when the British Empire tore her childhood apart, alone again. And then, as if time had not already taken enough from her, it came for her father. The early 1960s were cruel to Jawaharlal Nehru. In 1962, China's sudden attack across the Himalayas shattered his image of India as a moral giant guiding Asia. Indian troops, badly equipped and poorly led, were pushed back in humiliating retreat. The man who had spoken of non-alignment and peaceful coexistence watched the map of his country bleed at the edges. Indira saw what the public did not. Nehru pacing his room late at night, exhausted, eyes ringed with shadows. His hands shook slightly when he lifted a cup. The China debacle broke not just his foreign policy, but something in his spirit. In May 1964, his overstressed heart finally failed. The news crackled through the capital like a lightning bolt. Jawaharlal Nehru is dead. Outside Teen Murty House, crowds surged against the gates. People wailed, beat their chests, clutched at the iron railings as if they had lost a father. In the middle of that human storm, Indira moved like a ghost, receiving dignitaries, comforting party workers, trying not to fall apart. For 17 years, Nehru had been the towering figure holding India's fragile democracy together. Now there was a vacuum, and a race to fill it. Indira was not the favorite. The party bosses, the syndicate, gathered quickly. They feared two things: chaos in the streets, and a strong rival they could not control. Morarji Desai, then the powerful chief minister of Bombay State and a national leader, openly wanted the top job. To many in the Congress old guard, he seemed the obvious choice. Experienced, disciplined, no nonsense. But there was a problem. Morarji was hard to manage. He did not bend easily. He did not listen politely if he disagreed. For men like Kamaraj, who preferred to rule from the shadows, this was dangerous, so they looked for someone safe. They found Lal Bahadur Shastri, modest, soft-spoken, universally respected, unlikely to threaten their collective grip, and as a kind of emotional glue for the grieving nation, they persuaded Indira to join his cabinet as Minister of Information and Broadcasting. She accepted and walked into a different kind of fire. As I&B minister, she controlled radio, films, and government messaging, the nervous system of a young republic. She saw how narratives were shaped, how a government could be made to look heroic or helpless. She also saw how quickly affection could turn to anger. In 1965, Pakistan tested India's resolve with infiltrations in Kashmir and then full-scale war. Shastri, the quiet man everyone had underestimated, surprised the country with his steadiness. His simple slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, hail the soldier, hail the farmer, caught the public imagination. But the war was expensive. Food was short. Grain ships from America became lifelines. In smoky cabinet rooms, time felt like an enemy. How long could India hold out? How long before shortages turned into riots? In January 1966, Shastri went to Tashkent in the Soviet Union to sign a peace agreement with Pakistan. Indira watched the coverage roll in. Grainy black and white images of the small, bespectacled prime minister shaking hands with President Ayub Khan, the ink drying on hard-won peace. Then, in the freezing hours after midnight on 11th January, as the Indian delegation slept, Lal Bahadur Shastri's heart stopped in a guest house bed. Sudden, silent, no warning. Back in Delhi, a stunned Indira stood on the tarmac as Shastri's body, wrapped in the tricolor, was carried down the steps of the aircraft. The second Prime Minister of India had lasted barely 18 months. Once again, there was a vacuum. Once again, a clock started ticking. The syndicate moved fast. They had to choose a new leader before rival factions organized, before the public lost faith, before Morarji Desai forced their hand. Desai believed his time had finally come. He had seniority, experience, ambition. He announced his candidacy boldly, but Kamaraj and his allies were wary. They wanted someone with a famous name, a reassuring face, and, crucially, someone they could outvote in any serious argument. They turned to Indira. To many of them, she was still the quiet girl serving tea in Anand Bhavan, the dutiful daughter by Nehru's side, the grieving widow. Emotional capital, yes. Political threat? Surely not. In one whispered conversation after another, they reassured each other. She will be a figurehead. We will decide policy. She won't make trouble. They were so certain that one syndicate leader reportedly used a phrase that would stick to her like tar, Gungi Gudia, the dumb doll. But dolls do not bleed, and they do not remember. Congress MPs met to choose between Morarji Desai and Indira Gandhi. In that cramped room, under whirring fans and the gaze of portraits on the walls, a knife-edge vote unfolded. On one side, the stern ascetic Desai, radiating confidence. On the other, Indira, pale but composed, carrying the weight of Nehru's memory like invisible armor. When the counting ended, the result stunned Desai and his supporters. Indira Gandhi had won. On 24th of January 1966, she became the third Prime Minister of India. From the outside, it looked like continuity. Nehru's daughter stepping up to lead her father's nation. But inside those party rooms, a different story was playing out. A miscalculation so serious it would destroy generations of Congress leadership. Because Indira knew exactly what they thought of her. She knew they expected her to sit in that high office and obey, to sign where they pointed, speak the words they wrote, wear the sari they chose for her. And at first, for a while, she played along. Her early months as Prime Minister were brutal. India was hit by consecutive droughts. Rivers ran low. Cracked earth replaced green fields. Villages that had cheered independence now lined up for hours for a few kilos of grain. Crows picked at thin cattle carcasses on roadsides. Under pressure from the World Bank and the United States, the government devalued the rupee in 1966, hoping to boost exports and secure aid. Instead, prices shot up and tempers flared. In the bazaars of North India, traders cursed Indira ki mukt, Indira's ruin. In Parliament, opposition leaders jeered that she was surrendering India's sovereignty. Her popularity dipped. Newspapers began to whisper that she was out of her depth. The syndicate leaned in closer. Morarji Desai, now a senior figure in Delhi again, watched like a hawk, convinced the experiment would soon end. To him, every shortage, every protest was proof that the girl in the Prime Minister's chair was a mistake. Then came the 1967 elections, the first true test of India's democracy after Nehru, and a ticking bomb under Indira's feet. For the first time since independence, the Congress monopoly seemed vulnerable. New regional parties had sprung up, old loyalties were fraying. In state after state, local leaders had their own followings, their own resentments against Delhi. Indira campaigned relentlessly, crisscrossing the country in rickety aircraft and cars that broke down in dust-choked towns. She stood on makeshift platforms, hair whipped by hot winds, promising food, jobs, dignity. But the tide had turned. The Congress retained a majority at the center, thin, shaky, but lost power in several key states, including strongholds like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. For the first time, chief ministers from opposition parties took oaths in Raj Bhavans. The unthinkable was suddenly reality. India was no longer a one-party democracy. Inside the Congress, knives came out. The losses were blamed on her. The syndicate murmured about replacing the prime minister. To bind the party together, a compromise was forged. Morarji Desai became deputy prime minister and finance minister. The man who had lost the leadership contest now sat one heartbeat away from the throne, his hands on the nation's purse strings. Two very different Indias now coexisted in the cabinet room. One represented by Desai, austere, conservative, focused on order and fiscal discipline. The other, embodied by Indira, increasingly aware of the chasm between rich and poor, desperate to prove she was more than a name on a ballot. For a while they tried to govern together. It was like putting a live wire next to a barrel of petrol. Every budget, every policy became a tug-of-war. Desai distrusted populist measures, handouts, subsidies. Indira feared that without bold steps to help the poor, democracy itself was at risk. Furious arguments echoed in the corridors of power. Cabinet meetings stretched late into the night. And slowly, very slowly, she came to a hard conclusion. If she continued like this, she would not last. The syndicate would push her out at the next crisis and install Morarji Desai, the reliable man, in her place. If she wanted to survive, she had to stop being their compromise. She had to become their nightmare. The turning point came in 1969, 3 years after she became prime minister, and 3 years before the world would hail her as the woman who broke Pakistan in two. In the sweltering July heat, with barely a handful of confidants informed, Indira made her move. She prepared an ordinance to nationalize India's 14 largest private banks, institutions that had for decades decided who got loans, which industries grew, which farmers sank deeper into debt. For businessmen in Bombay and Calcutta, these banks were safe vaults for their power. For millions of small farmers and traders, they were locked doors. On a monsoon evening, as rain hammered the roofs of Delhi, the paperwork was finished. The ordinance went to President V. Giri for his signature. Then, before the syndicate or Morarji Desai could react, All India Radio crackled with the stunning announcement. From this day, India, as major banks belong to the nation. In one stroke, without warning, she had seized the financial commanding heights from private hands and placed them under government control. The left applauded. The poor, hearing the news on crackling radios in tea shops and village squares, felt a distant hope. Maybe now, finally, money would flow their way. The syndicate was livid. Morarji Desai felt personally stabbed. As finance minister, he had not been fully consulted on a decision that reshaped his entire domain. Within days, he resigned from both posts, finance minister and deputy prime minister. Walking out of the cabinet in cold fury, the dumb doll had not only spoken, she had shouted, and she wasn't finished. Later that year, another confrontation arrived. The election of India's president. The syndicate chose Neelam Sanjeeva Reddy as the official Congress candidate. Indira disagreed. She preferred the sitting vice president, V. Giri, the same man who had just signed her bank nationalization ordinance. The party ordered MPs to vote for Reddy. Indira told them to vote according to your conscience, a thinly veiled signal to defy the official line. It was open war. On polling day, in silent booths under the watchful eyes of party whips, Congress MPs made their choice. When the ballots were counted, it was V. Giri, backed by Indira's rebellion, who won. The syndicate, humiliated, moved to expel her supporters. Indira struck back, calling a meeting of her own faction. Overnight, the party that had led India to freedom split in two: Congress, O, Organization, the Old Guard, and Congress, R. Requisition, the rebels around Indira, soon to be known simply as the real Congress. The split was a political earthquake. Newspapers printed diagrams just to explain who was now on which side. In Parliament, the Prime Minister now led a minority government, propped up by outside support from the left. On paper, she was weaker than ever, surrounded by enemies in and out of her own party, under constant attack from the Grand Alliance of opposition parties. By all conventional calculations, her time was running out. But out in the villages, something else was happening. She began to travel again, farther, harder, deeper into the India the syndicate barely saw. Her slogan was simple, almost brutal in its clarity: Garibi Hatao, remove poverty. At dusty crossroads and in floodlit maidens, she spoke directly to the poor, the landless laborers, the urban slum dwellers, the women, who had never seen a ballot before. She promised land reforms, food security, jobs, dignity. She painted the election as a choice not between parties, but between two worlds, one that wanted to keep power locked in drawing rooms and one that would crack the doors open. Her rivals scoffed. They called her reckless, accused her of demagogy, warned that her policies would bankrupt the state. In crowded meetings, Morarji Desai and other opposition leaders mocked her as dictatorial, emotional, unstable. But something in her words resonated in the dust and heat. By late 1970, with Parliament increasingly unmanageable and her minority government under constant threat, she made a decision that stunned friends and foes alike. She dissolved the Lok Sabha early and called for fresh elections in 1971, 2 years before they were due. It was the biggest gamble of her life. If she lost, she would not just be out of office. Her entire break with the old Congress would be branded a historic mistake. Morarji Desai and the syndicate could claim vindication, march back to power, and bury her career under words like emotional and inexperienced. If she won, she would emerge with something no syndicate could ever give her, an undeniable personal mandate from the people of India. In the months that followed, the country turned into a giant arena. The opposition parties, Congress, the Yan Sang, the Swatantra Party, Socialists, formed the Grand Alliance, united by one shared goal: Indira Hatao, remove Indira. Crowds gathered in city squares and village fields to watch this duel. On one side, coalitions of experienced male politicians, armed with statistics and scorn. On the other, a lone woman in a plain sari, often speaking hoarsely into microphones that crackled and died, promising something dangerously close to hope. She spoke of hungry children with empty steel plates, of landlords with fields they never tilled, of banks that had once financed only the rich. She conjured images so sharp that people carried them home in their heads. A nation where the last person in the last village would feel the government's hand not as a blow but as support. The air was thick with dust, slogans, and a question: who would run out of time first, Indira Gandhi or the old order? When the results came, they did not trickle. They crashed. Constituency after constituency fell to Congress, The supposed rump party swept the polls, winning a crushing majority in the Lok Sabha. Opposition stalwarts were toppled. In Surat, even Morarji Desai, the man who had once been inches from the prime minister's chair, lost his seat. A stunned silence followed, then a roar. In streets and slums and villages, people danced, lit fireworks, smeared color on each other's faces. Somewhere in Delhi, a scribbled slogan on a wall said it plainly: Indira is India. India is Indira. It was an exaggeration. It was dangerous. It was real. In less than 5 years, the dumb doll had smashed the syndicate, captured the banks, split the party, and won the biggest democratic mandate any Indian leader had ever enjoyed since independence. She had not just come to power, she had remade the road that led to it. But as she stood on the steps of Parliament in March 1971, accepting congratulations under a hard blue sky, another storm was already building to the east. Within months, 10 million refugees would pour into India from East Pakistan. Armies would mobilize. Bombs would fall on Indian airfields in the dead of night. And Indira Gandhi, now at the height of her power, would discover that winning an election was only the beginning of her real war. On a winter afternoon in December 1971, the world watched something it was not prepared to see. A woman in a plain cotton sari, at the head of a poor, hungry, chaotic country, calmly redraw the map of South Asia in just 13 days. Only 5 years earlier, that same woman had been mocked as a dumb doll, a temporary stand-in until the real men of politics reclaimed the throne. Now those men sat in jail cells, in diplomatic lounges, in hostile foreign capitals, staring at their radios as a voice from New Delhi declared, India is now at war. The storm that pulled her into that war began not with tanks, but with trains. They groaned across the eastern border from East Pakistan into India, packed to the roofs. People hung from windows, piled in luggage racks, jammed into corridors. Whole families staggered off at small stations in West Bengal, Tripura, Assam, barefoot, carrying nothing but a cloth bundle and the memory of what they had seen. Behind them, in what was then East Pakistan, the Pakistani army had unleashed a campaign of terror after the Bengali electorate dared to vote the wrong way. Villages burned. Students were shot on campuses. Intellectuals disappeared. Women, in numbers too large, too painful to count, were dragged into makeshift barracks and raped. By the monsoon of 1971, almost 10 million refugees had poured into India. Imagine it. Entire states suddenly hosting an extra population larger than many countries. Fields became refugee camps. School buildings turned into dormitories of despair. Every day, more skeletal children, more hollow-eyed men, more women who would not speak. Indira Gandhi walked through those camps with a notebook in her hand and a storm inside her. The smell of sweat, latrines, and boiled rice clung to her sari. People clutched her wrist, sobbing. A boy with matchstick legs saluted her and asked, "When can we go home?" Home? In Delhi, her own advisors whispered about burden, about economic strain, about the risk of communal tension in border states. International donors promised some sacks of grain, some money, a few sympathetic editorials, and then told her to exercise restraint. Restraint. While a genocide unfolded next door, in Washington, President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger had chosen their side. On the secret White House tapes, they sneered about her, called her names. Pakistan was their ally, their link to Beijing, their card in the Cold War game. The suffering of Bengalis was, at best, an inconvenience. Indira went on a diplomatic offensive that felt, at times, like begging. Moscow, London, Paris, Bonn, Ottawa, Washington. She flew from capital to capital, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, pressing photographs of massacres into the hands of men who checked their watches as she spoke. In Washington, she sat in the Oval Office across from Nixon's cold gaze. He lectured her about stability, warned her not to use force, insisted that the crisis was internal to Pakistan. She answered in careful, controlled sentences, but inside something snapped. She walked out of that city convinced of one thing: India was alone. If she waited, if she obeyed, if she respected the lectures of powerful men, then the refugees would rot in their camps. East Pakistan would be crushed into silence, and the fire on India's border would only grow hotter. But war was not a simple choice. It was a clock. Every week, more refugees. Every week, more strain on India's fragile economy. Every week, the monsoon mud thickened on the Eastern Front, complicating any military operation. And looming beyond all of it was the fear that if India moved too late, the great powers would impose a ceasefire that froze the map before the Bengalis were free, so she made another move first. In August 1971, she signed the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation, a cold, hard insurance policy. If the United States and China tilted openly towards Pakistan, India would not stand entirely alone. The treaty was a signal to the world: if you corner us, we will not go quietly. By autumn, the guerrilla resistance in East Pakistan, the Mukti Bahini, had grown bolder. Indian training and weapons flowed across borders under the cover of darkness. In Delhi, war plans were drawn, red arrows inching across maps while the Prime Minister sat in late-night briefings, face expressionless, fingers steepled. The question was not if Pakistan would react. The question was when. On the evening of the 3rd December 1971, the answer came from the sky. Pakistani jets roared across the western border and bombed Indian airfields from Pathankot to Agra. Smoke rose over runways, craters pocked the tarmac. In the Prime Minister's office, an aide rushed in with the first reports. Indira listened, nodded once, then stepped to the microphone for a nationwide broadcast. Her voice, calm but edged with steel, carried into millions of homes. "The Pakistani Air Force has struck at our airfields. We stand at the moment of great peril and challenge." The war she had tried so hard to avoid now unfolded on two fronts, but the real battle in her mind was for the East. She pushed the generals: move fast, cut through, take Dhaka, end this before the superpowers could shove a ceasefire down India's throat. 13 days, that was all it took. Indian forces and the Mukti Bahini advanced with a speed that stunned foreign observers. Bridges were taken intact. Town after town fell. Pakistani units, cut off, began to surrender in clusters. On 16th of December, under a gray Dhaka sky, Lieutenant General A.K. Niazi of Pakistan signed an instrument of surrender before Indian General Jagjit Singh Arora. 93,000 Pakistani soldiers laid down their arms. A new country, Bangladesh, was born on the map. In villages across India, people poured into the streets, dancing, weeping, bursting firecrackers. They scrawled her name on walls, carried her photograph in processions. A poor, exhausted democracy had done what even many rich countries had never managed: win a swift, decisive war for the sake of strangers. Abroad, headlines that had mocked now proclaimed, "The Iron Lady of India." In whispered tones, diplomats compared her not to her father, but to emperors. Her old rival, Morarji Desai, watched it all from the margins, furious and powerless. Jaya Prakash Narayan, the aging Gandhian moral voice, acknowledged her achievement but warned that power is a dangerous thing. In the afterglow of victory, those warnings sounded like jealousy. The country was drunk on pride. So was she. But pride does not feed people. By 1973, the battlefield euphoria had faded into a gray, grinding reality. The global oil crisis slammed into India like a train, sending fuel prices rocketing. Monsoon failures returned. Inflation bit into the price of every grain of rice, every liter of kerosene. Urban workers went on strike. Students marched. In the countryside, the promises of Garibi Hataao collided with a stubborn old reality of landlords, middlemen, and corrupt local officials. The Green Revolution had transformed parts of Punjab and Haryana into oceans of wheat and rice, but other regions lagged behind. The sight of overflowing government granaries next to hungry families was a wound she could not ignore. She tried to keep moving forward. She abolished the privy purses, the lifetime government payments to former princes who had once ruled small kingdoms. It was a symbolic beheading of the old India, and the princes, stripped of official status and money, seethed. She pushed for more land reforms, more public distribution of food, more subsidies. Her speeches grew sharper. The rich must sacrifice, the poor must be lifted up. But every rupee she spent deepened the budget crisis. The same technocrats who had warned against bank nationalization now came back with new graphs and new frowns. In May 1974, on a remote patch of desert in Rajasthan called Pokhran, she made a decision that stunned the world once again. Under the cover of a peaceful nuclear experiment, Indian scientists and engineers dug deep into the earth, wired explosives, and retreated to bunkers. When the device detonated, a dull thud rolled through the sand. A mushroom of dust and rock rose into the burning sky. India had tested a nuclear bomb. The code name was oddly innocent, Smiling Buddha, but its meaning was anything but. A poor, aid-dependent nation had just joined the most exclusive and feared club in the world. Western governments seethed. Sanctions, export controls, diplomatic cold shoulders followed. Inside India, her supporters saw it as a masterstroke. "We may be poor," one villager said, "but now they have to respect us." Her critics, including Morarji Desai, called it reckless, a vanity project that wasted money while children starved. Somewhere between those two verdicts, Indira Gandhi began to change. The young woman who had once second-guessed herself, who had worried about living up to her father's ideals, was now a leader who had won a war, broken Pakistan in two, and built a nuclear deterrent. Crowds chanted, "Indira Lao Desh Bachao," "Bring Indira, save the nation." It is intoxicating, being told you are the nation. It is also deadly. Around her, the circle tightened. Her younger son, Sanjay Gandhi, restless, ambitious, more comfortable in the company of fixers than philosophers, drifted into the center of power. His dream of building a people's car, the Maruti, had floundered in a swamp of bureaucracy and bad decisions. But failure did not humble him. It made him hungry. Courtiers and party hacks began to orbit Sanjay. He moved through the corridors of power like a prince in waiting, barking orders, promising shortcuts. When civil servants hesitated, they were told, "This is the Prime Minister's son." Soon they stopped hesitating. Outside, a different kind of storm gathered. In Gujarat and Bihar, students exploded in anger over rising prices, corruption, and unemployment. Protests spread from campus lawns to city streets, then to entire states. Buses burned, police lathas cracked down. In 1974, the moral center of India's freedom struggle, Jayaprakash Narayan, JP, stepped out of retirement, wrapped his frail body in khadi once more, and stood at the head of a new movement. He called it total revolution, a demand not just for a change of government, but for a complete transformation of politics, economics, and society. His voice shook, but his words cut deep. He accused Indira Gandhi of betraying the freedom struggle, of centralizing power, of breeding corruption. On stages across North India, he raised a finger and said, "Prime Minister, resign." Morarji Desai, the man she had outmaneuvered in 1966 and humiliated in 1971, found new life under JP's banner. Old socialists, right-wing John Song leaders, disgruntled congressmen, they all crowded together into a strange, fragile alliance, united by one goal: remove Indira. The conflict that had once been an internal party rivalry now became a national duel. Morarji versus Indira, JP versus Indira. The old man of moral authority and the old rival of political ambition, standing together against the woman who controlled the state. And then came the verdict that turned this simmering confrontation into a countdown. In a courtroom in Allahabad, a little-known politician named Raj Narayan had been patiently fighting a legal case for years, accusing her of using government machinery in her 1971 parliamentary campaign in Raebareli. It sounded petty at first, the use of a government official, a few misused resources, something that, in the rough world of politics, many had done. But the judge, Justice Jagmohan Lal Sinha, did not see it as petty. On 12th of June 1975, he delivered his ruling. Indira Gandhi was found guilty of electoral malpractice. Her 1971 election was declared invalid. She was barred from holding any elected office for 6 years. In the Prime Minister's residence, the news landed like a physical blow. Ministers stared at the radio, stunned. She sat very still, lips pressed tight. If the judgment stood, she would have to resign as Prime Minister. Her lawyers rushed to the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice granted a partial stay. She could remain in office while her appeal was heard, but she could not vote in Parliament. It was a legal bandage, not a cure. Everyone understood what it meant. She had days, maybe weeks. Time had become a knife at her throat. The opposition smelled victory. JP called for massive nationwide protests. If she does not resign, he cried from a Delhi stage, we will force her to resign by a people's movement. He urged the police and the army to follow their conscience, not illegal orders. To Indira, this was not just rhetoric. It sounded like sedition, a direct invitation to the forces to disobey the elected government. On the evening of 25th of June 1975, at the Ramlila Maidan in Delhi, JP led a sea of people in what felt like a rehearsal for revolution. Banners demanded her resignation. Loudspeakers blared slogans. In the sticky heat, under bare bulbs, he shouted into the night that the time had come for do or die. A few kilometers away, in her residence on Safdarjung Road, Indira Gandhi sat in a small room with her closest advisors. Files lay open on the table. Intelligence reports warning of chaos, of planned blockades of parliament, of strikes that could paralyze government. Her information minister, K. Gujral, pleaded for restraint. The West Bengal chief minister advised caution. Another voice was louder, Sanjay's. He and a handful of hardliners like Siddhartha Shankar Ray argued that the country was on the verge of anarchy, that JP wanted to overthrow a democratically elected government in the name of people's power. Use the Constitution, they urged. Use the powers it gives you. Declare an emergency. She got up, walked to another room, and sat alone for a long time. It was late. The city outside hummed with the last of the protest crowds returning home. In the darkness, the daughter of a man who had gone to prison again and again for freedom now weighed whether to suspend some of that very freedom to keep her seat, and, as she believed, to save the state. Shortly before midnight, she picked up a pen. Article 352 of the Constitution allows a prime minister to advise the president to declare a state of emergency if the security of India is threatened by war, external aggression, or internal disturbance. Her note argued that a grave internal disturbance existed, that a conspiracy threatened the stability of the republic. President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, roused from sleep, signed. Phones began to ring in police headquarters across the country. Before dawn, plainclothes officers fanned out with lists of names. Trucks pulled up outside the homes of opposition leaders. Morarji Desai was woken by a knock, told to pack a small bag, and driven away to a prison cell. Jaya Prakash Narayan, frail and ill, was taken too. So were thousands of student leaders, trade unionists, journalists, even a few dissenters from her own party. Printing presses of unfriendly newspapers went silent. Power was cut to some in the middle of the night. When Indians woke up on 26th of June, they turned on the radio to hear her calm voice announce that the president had proclaimed an emergency. That the life of the nation was in danger, that discipline must be restored. The key rival she had feared most, the alliance of JP and Morarji, was now behind bars. The clock that had been ticking above her head stopped, or so it seemed. What followed is the darkest, most contested chapter of her life. Censorship descended like a thick curtain. Editors were told what they could and could not print. Critical columns were spiked. Cartoonists who had once mocked her freely now sharpened their pens in vain. One brave newspaper left its editorial page blank one day, a silent scream. Civil liberties shrank. Under the Draconian Maintenance of Internal Security Act, MISA, thousands were detained without trial. Court after court refused to interfere. In a chilling verdict, the Supreme Court declared that during the emergency, even the right to life could be suspended. Inside government buildings, though, some people marveled. Trains were running on time. Strikes vanished overnight. Bureaucrats hurried to meet deadlines. Business leaders whispered that a little bit of dictatorship was not such a bad thing. The World Bank praised India's new focus on population control and discipline. And within the narrow inner circle, a young man with no official post wielded terrifying influence. Sanjay Gandhi became the face of a new ruthless order. He talked of removing slums, beautifying Delhi, controlling population. In practice, that meant bulldozers rumbling into crowded neighborhoods like Turkman Gate, smashing homes, scattering belongings into the dust. It meant quotas of sterilizations imposed on terrified health officers. In 1976 alone, more than 8 million people were sterilized, a number so huge it almost defies imagination. Poor men were dragged into vans, herded into makeshift camps, given cursory operations, and pushed out, groggy and bleeding. Some died. Stories spread of teenage boys, even unmarried men, being picked up to meet targets. In villages, families whispered a new terror, not famine, not riot, but the white van at dusk. Indira heard some of these stories. Ministers who tried to warn her found doors closing in their faces. Others, eager to please, lied, saying everything was smooth, that only antisocial elements were suffering. Surrounded by flattery and fear, she drifted further into a world where official files said one thing and the streets said another. Her old rival Morarji sat in a cell, reading, waiting. JP's health collapsed in detention. He would never fully recover. Yet even from hospital beds, their names carried a strange, quiet power. They were the men who had refused to bend. Outside, time was not frozen. It was fermenting. Resentment grew in silence. The poor remembered the night the bulldozers came. Middle-class families remembered the knock on the door. Students remembered the friends who never returned from police stations. Even Congress Party workers, humiliated by Sanjay's arrogant youth brigades, muttered curses out of earshot. Then, in early 1977, in a move that shocked almost everyone, she did something no dictator ever has to do. She announced elections. Her advisors had told her the emergency had been a success. The trains, the GDP numbers, the tamed press, they all seemed to point in one direction. Intelligence reports, doctored on their way up, assured her that the people were grateful. She believed, or chose to believe, that the discipline she had imposed would be rewarded. The opposition, released from jail in stages, stumbled blinking into the sunlight. Morarji, thinner but still iron-spined, Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Lal Krishna Advani from the Jan Sangh, old socialists who had once despised the right wing, they all joined hands in a new party, the Janata Party. The duel that had begun in a smoky Congress committee room a decade earlier was now on open ground. Indira Gandhi versus Morarji Desai, a face-to-face before the people. She campaigned hard, but something was different. Crowds still came, but their eyes were colder. In villages, women stepped forward to shout about lost homes and forced operations. In towns, students held up black flags. She spoke of stability, of development, of discipline. They remembered handcuffs and scissors. On counting day, the illusion shattered. Constituency after constituency in North India fell not to her party but to Janata. Cabinet ministers were trounced. Her younger son Sanjay lost in Amethi. Most shocking of all, in Raebareli, the seat she had held since 1967, the place that had once treated her name like a talisman, she was defeated. Morarji Desai, the man who had watched her climb past him in 1966, who had lost his seat in the tidal wave of her 1971 victory, now walked into Rashtrapati Bhavan as the new Prime Minister of India. At 80, the rival she had outmaneuvered and humiliated finally sat in the chair he believed had always been his. In a small room in her bungalow on Safdarjung Road, Indira Gandhi began packing her books into cardboard boxes. Outside, firecrackers popped again, not for a war this time, but for a quieter kind of victory. People said the word democracy with a new tenderness, as if it had almost died and been brought back. She had conquered Pakistan, defied America, split her own party, and ruled with more power than any Indian prime minister before or since. And yet, in the end, it was the silent, secret anger of voters with ink on their fingers that brought her down. As the car door closed and she was driven away from the house where she had signed the emergency into life, she glanced back just once. The guard saluted. The flag hung still in the heavy air. The woman who had been hailed as a savior in 1971 now left office as a symbol of overreach and fear. But her story was not finished. Defeat for Indira Gandhi was never the final line, only the start of another countdown. They thought they had watched her leave power for the last time. What no one knew as the car rolled out of Safdarjung Road in 1977 was that Indira Gandhi would drive back through those same gates as prime minister in less than 3 years, and that 7 years after her fall she would lie on that driveway in a spreading pool of her own blood. For the moment, though, she was just another defeated politician packing up her life. Books, papers, framed photographs of her father and of world leaders she had once met as an equal all went into cardboard boxes. Her staff tried not to stare. She moved methodically, almost coldly, as if this were someone else's story. Only once did she allow herself a crack in the mask. She paused before a picture from 1971, soldiers garlanding her, victory burning bright in their faces. Then she turned away. Her old rival, Morarji Desai, sat in the prime minister's chair at last. At 80, he was everything she was not. Austere where she was theatrical, dry where she was emotive, proud of saying no where she had often said yes. To him, her defeat was not just a political result, it was justice, and he intended to prove it. The new Janata government set up commissions of inquiry into the emergency. Shah Commission hearings dug into abuses, excesses, detentions, sterilizations. Retired judges, civil servants, policemen trooped in to testify. Officials who had rushed to obey Sanjay Gandhi now rushed to distance themselves. Her name, her son's name, were repeated like a curse. Television cameras, still rare in India, lingered on every damning statement. Newspapers, once censored, now reveled in payback. Cartoons depicted her behind bars, stripped of her famous nose, her famous hair. A villain, not a leader. In small towns, crowds gathered around radio sets as witnesses described forced sterilizations, bulldozed slums, midnight knocks on the door. She was no longer Mother India. She was the author of what many now called a dictatorship. Yet outside the headlines, something stranger was happening. She began to travel. Not as prime minister now, not in the armored convoys that had once sliced through traffic, but in more modest cars, on slower schedules. She went to villages where she had once been mobbed by adoring crowds, and found to her surprise that people still came. Some came to scold. Women shouted about emergency terror, about sons dragged off for operations. Farmers complained about rising prices under both her and Janata. But others came to touch her hand to say that whatever her sins, she had been strong, that she had kept India together. In Delhi drawing rooms, the consensus was clear. She was finished. Discredited, toxic. In the dust of the countryside, the verdict was fuzzier. Meanwhile, inside the Janata government, the clock began to tick in a new way. Janata was not a party. It was an uneasy marriage of enemies. Old socialists who had once fought landlords now sat cabinet to cabinet with Hindu nationalists from the Jan Sangh. Personal egos, old grudges, ideological differences, all were buried temporarily in the thrill of having ousted her. But governing is slower, more boring, more unforgiving than rebellion. Inflation kept nipping. Faction leaders fought over ministries. Phones crackled with intrigue. This one trying to bring down that one promising to split the party. Morarji's stern lectures on prohibition and discipline did not fill empty stomachs. From the backbenches and then from outside Parliament, Indira watched and waited. In 1978, she made her first audacious move. She formally split from the old Congress organization and created a new party, Congress I, the I standing quite openly for Indira. It was a declaration of war, not just against Janata, but against those Congress leaders who thought they could inherit the party without her. They laughed. A party named after herself. A personality cult, nothing more. Then in November that year came a by-election in Chikmagalur, a hilly constituency in Karnataka. She decided to contest it. As she campaigned, the rallies grew. Women in cheap saris, men in worn shirts, students with homemade banners. They pushed forward, eager to see if the fallen queen still had her old fire. She spoke not of 1971 or of nuclear tests. She spoke of insult, of vendetta, of attempts to humiliate me. She admitted to mistakes, but painted them as misjudged acts of a leader too committed to discipline, not as cold-blooded tyranny. When the votes were counted, she had won, by a large margin. The message cut through Delhi's gossip like a blade. The woman they had publicly buried was alive in the minds of millions. Janata panicked. In October 1977, she had already been arrested once on charges related to abuses during the emergency. The arrest warrant was badly drafted. The case collapsed. Now, in 1978, they tried again. She was taken into custody and lodged briefly in Delhi's Tihar jail. If her enemies hoped to break her, they miscalculated. The image ricocheted across India. Indira Gandhi, the daughter of a man who had gone to British prisons for freedom, now herself behind bars in independent India, at the orders of her rival Morarji Desai. To her supporters, it was proof that Janata was vindictive. To many neutrals, it simply felt unseemly. From her cell, she wrote letters, met visitors, let the cameras see her in white cotton, unbowed. She was not the dictator now. She was the victim, the martyr. The roles had reversed. Outside, Janata was eating itself alive. Charan Singh, leader of the powerful farmers' lobby and deputy prime minister, plotted against Morarji. The John Song faction was accused of smuggling its old cadres into state institutions. Socialists muttered about betrayal. Cabinet meetings turned poisonous. In 1979, the government finally cracked. Desai resigned, bitter. Charan Singh briefly became prime minister with outside support from Indira's Congress, a strange tactical alignment. Then she withdrew that support, letting his government fall before it could even face parliament. The duel that had started in 1966 had swung wildly in 13 years. She had beaten Morarji, he had beaten her, and now both his government and his moral authority lay in rubble. General elections were called for January 1980. The country had to choose the chaotic coalition that had promised to cleanse politics and instead imploded, or the woman whose emergency still haunted people in the dark. Time was tight. The Janata factions had weeks to patch their quarrels. Indira had weeks to convince India to forgive her. She campaigned harder than ever before. Her voice, a little hoarser now, pushed through microphones in town after town. She did not dwell on the emergency laws. She hammered away at instability, weakness, gadar, betrayal. She painted herself as the only person capable of holding the center of a dangerous, fragmented country. The voters made a brutal, simple choice. Janata was wiped out in North India. Her new party swept back with a colossal majority. Charan Singh lost. Morarji's era ended in humiliation. Indira Gandhi, less than 3 years after being thrown out by the same electorate, walked back into the prime minister's office. Behind the triumphal headlines, though, something had changed. She was older. The hair that had once been dramatically striped black and white was now mostly silver. The lines around her mouth were deeper. And inside, according to those who worked with her, there was less of the old vulnerability and more of a hard, almost fatalistic resolve. Her younger son, Sanjay, was again by her side. Despite his emergency-era notoriety, he had won a Lok Sabha seat in 1980. In Delhi's narrow lanes, he was remembered as the man who had torn down homes. In party offices, he was the prince of the new order, drawing up candidate lists, bullying chief ministers, dreaming of another round of discipline. The central conflict of her political life, Indira versus Morarji, was, for all practical purposes, over. Now a new set of rivalries began, mother and son versus a restless party, a centralizing state versus angry regions, the fragile Indian Union versus forces that wanted it broken. And over it all, as the 1980s opened, hung the shadow of time. On 23 June 1980, the clock stopped for her chosen heir. It was a clear morning in Delhi when Sanjay climbed into a small blue plane at Safdarjung Airport for a test flight. Flying was his passion, his escape. He took off, banked low over the city, too low. Witnesses saw the aircraft dipping, wobbling, then plunging nose first into a patch of land near a construction site. There were no survivors. The wreckage was twisted aluminum and smoking earth. A crowd gathered in stunned silence, staring at the plane's torn fuselage. Somewhere under that tangle lay the man who had once roared orders at ministers, who had threatened and schemed and dreamed of ruling after his mother. At Ames, Indira was led to his body. The woman who had held firm as prime minister when generals saluted, when war reports came in, now collapsed, sobbing, over her son. She had watched her father die slowly, watched her husband fade, but nothing had prepared her for the suddenness of this. The political consequences were immediate. Sanjay's young widow, Maneka, pregnant at the time, was surrounded by his loyalists who wanted her to inherit his mantle. Indira, deep in grief, clashed with her daughter-in-law. Accusations flew in both directions. Within 2 years, Maneka would leave the house, baby Varun in her arms, after a bitter shouting match. Even in mourning, Indira's home was a battlefield. With Sanjay gone and the party restless, elders turned to the one Gandhi who had so far avoided politics. Rajiv. Rajiv Gandhi was an airline pilot, quiet, almost shy, happy in a small home with his Italian-born wife Sonia and their children. He had watched his mother's career from a distance and wanted no part of its compromises. But now, party workers pleaded. Senior leaders warned that without a Gandhi at the core, Congress could tear itself apart. Indira, still raw from Sanjay's death, persuaded him. In 1981, Rajiv entered politics. The countdown restarted. She had to turn this reluctant gentleman into a political operator before age and events overtook her. Outside Delhi, new fires were already burning. In Punjab, anger simmered over water rights, language, religious autonomy. The Green Revolution had brought wealth to some farmers, but also deepened inequalities. The Akali Dal, the main Sikh political party, demanded more power for the state and a greater recognition of Sikh identity. In this tense landscape, a fiery preacher rose, Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. Bearded, charismatic, with a chilling certainty in his voice, Bhindranwale railed against corruption, drugs, injustice. Young men flocked to him. Congress politicians in Punjab, hoping to divide the Akali Dal, initially saw him as a useful counterweight. It was a cynical game. Unleash a tiger to scare your rival, believing you can still hold the leash. They were wrong. By the early 1980s, Bhindranwale's followers were linked to killings, bank robberies, targeted assassinations. Hindu shopkeepers were shot in villages. Police officers died in ambushes. Fear seeped into daily routines, a bus journey, a market visit, a walk at dusk. Bhindranwale and his armed supporters moved into the Golden Temple complex in Amritsar, Sikhism's holiest shrine. From that sanctified space, weapons and messages flowed. For many Sikhs, the temple was above politics. For others, it was now the headquarters of a movement that spoke to their wounded pride. Every day that passed, the situation deteriorated. Each killing provoked a harsher response. Each harsh response pushed more young men into militancy. Her intelligence chiefs told Indira that Pakistan's ISI was beginning to fish in these troubled waters, training and arming extremists across the border. Time once again felt like a trap. Wait too long and Punjab might spin out of control, encouraging other separatist movements from Kashmir to the northeast. Act too fast, and she risked a bloodbath in one of the most sacred places in India. Her rival now was not a single man like Morarji, but a hydra-headed thing, rage, religion, geopolitics. But she responded in the way she knew best, by centralizing, by calling in the army. In early June 1984, as monsoon clouds gathered, Operation Blue Star was launched. Under cover of darkness, tanks and armored personnel carriers rolled through the narrow streets of Amritsar toward the Golden Temple. Pilgrims, including women and children, were still inside. Soldiers went in with orders to flush out extremists. What happened over the next 3 days remains one of the most searing and contested episodes in modern Indian history. Automatic fire echoed off marble walls. Explosions ripped through courtyards. The sacred Akal Takht building was shattered by shells. When the smoke cleared, the complex was scarred by bullet holes and blackened stone. Official figures put the dead in the hundreds. Other estimates say many more. Among the bodies were militants with assault rifles and unarmed devotees who had been caught in the crossfire. Photographs of the damaged shrine traveled like lightning through Sikh communities in India and abroad. For many, it felt like sacrilege, like an attack not just on extremists but on their faith itself. Indira Gandhi had removed a militant stronghold. She had also, in the eyes of thousands, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. From that moment, a new deadly countdown began, one she was warned about again and again. Her security advisors told her that Sikh bodyguards should be reassigned, at least temporarily. Intelligence reports spoke of plots, of revenge oaths taken in gurdwaras and safe houses. Lists of suspects landed on her desk. She refused to remove all Sikh officers from her detail. How would it look, she asked, if the Prime Minister of India says she cannot trust her own people? It would send the wrong message, she argued. It would punish loyal men for the sins of a few. Some around her, even those who admired her courage, thought she was tempting fate. In public, she was defiant. In a speech in Bhubaneswar just days before her death, she told a cheering crowd, "I am alive today. I may not be there tomorrow. I shall continue to serve till my last breath. And when I die, I can say that every drop of my blood will invigorate India." No one in that crowd knew how literal those words would become. On the morning of 31st October 1984, Delhi was washed in pale autumn light. At 1 Safdarjung Road, Indira Gandhi, dressed in an orange-red sari with a black border. She had a television interview scheduled with a British crew at her official residence next door, 1 Akbar Road. To reach the studio, she had to walk down a shaded path through the garden past a small guard post. It was just after 9 a.m. when she stepped out with a few aides. Leaves rustled. Sparrows flitted between branches. 2 of her Sikh bodyguards stood ahead, Bent Singh and Satwant Singh. As she approached, Bent raised his revolver and fired 3 shots into her abdomen. She fell or half fell, and as she dropped, Satwant opened up with an automatic rifle, spraying bullets into her crumpling body. Later, doctors would count more than 30 wounds. The path was suddenly a scene from a nightmare. Her sari soaked dark, her white hair streaked with blood, sandals twisted at odd angles. Aides screamed. The gunmen dropped their weapons. Bent was shot dead by other guards moments later. Satwant was captured, dazed. They bundled her into a white ambassador car. Blood pooled on the seat and dripped onto the floor. Traffic was halted, red lights ignored as the car raced to AMS. In the operating theater, surgeons worked frantically, their gowns turning red. But the bullets had torn through vital organs. By early afternoon, Indira Gandhi, who had outwitted party bosses, defied presidents, split Pakistan, stared down American pressure, gone to war and to the brink of dictatorship, was dead at 66. The news spread through Delhi like an electric shock. Offices shut, shutters slammed down. All India radio fell back on funereal language. The Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, is no more. And then, in the hours and days that followed, the country she had tried to hold together came frighteningly close to tearing itself apart. Rumors flew that Sikhs had killed her. Not 2 specific men, but an entire community. Mobs formed, often led by local political fixers, some with links to the very party she had led. Sikh homes and shops were marked, looted, burned. Men were dragged from their houses, beaten, doused in kerosene, set on fire. In some neighborhoods, kerosene ran in the gutters. In Delhi alone, over 3,000 Sikhs were killed in 3 days. The police, in countless cases, stood by or looked away. Trains pulled into stations in North India with blood-smeared carriages, silent except for the wailing of survivors. At a rally days later, her son Rajiv, now almost by default Prime Minister, uttered a sentence that would haunt him. "When a big tree falls, the earth shakes." For those who had lost fathers, brothers, children in the pogrom, it sounded less like explanation and more like excuse. Her body lay in state, draped in the tricolor, on the grounds of Teen Murti Bhavan, where she had once played as a child. Millions filed past, some weeping, some simply staring, trying to reconcile the stillness of the woman on the bier with the intensity of the life she had led. She was cremated on the banks of the Yamuna, not far from her father's memorial. The flames rose, the smoke dispersed into a hazy Delhi sky. Crowds surged forward, desperate for a last glimpse, for a pinch of ash. In the years since, India has argued endlessly about Indira Gandhi. Was she the savior of 1971 or the autocrat of 1975? The pioneer of nuclear independence or the author of Operation Blue Star? The woman who gave the poor a voice, or the leader who allowed her son to run wild with slum demolitions and sterilization drives? Her greatest rival, Morarji Desai, outlived her by more than a decade, dying quietly in 1995. Many of the men who had cursed her in Parliament later admitted, in private moments, that she had been the most formidable politician they had ever faced. Decades on, trains still cross the borders she redrew. Nuclear tests still shake the same deserts she once used as a proving ground. The constitution she bent, and nearly broke, still structures the world's largest democracy. In villages, old women still tell stories of the prime minister who came in a plain cotton sari and made the whole country tremble. She lived under a constant ticking clock. The countdowns of wars, of elections, of court verdicts, of insurgencies, of personal grief. Sometimes she beat the clock. In the end, she didn't. But in the story of modern India, the shadow of Indira Gandhi still falls long, like that of a very big tree, one whose fall shook. The earth and whose roots, for better and worse, are still tangled deep in the soil.